So I saw a video the other day that really struck me. It was short, it was maybe 60 seconds. And the argument was simple. One of the best things we could do for the mental health of young people is to encourage them to drink again. Not to excess, not irresponsibly, but to go to a bar, to sit at a table, to have a beer with a friend. And my first reaction was, you can't say that. Then I started to think about it and I realized I think this might actually be one of the most important things I've heard in a long time. And I think it's something the wine industry needs to wrestle with. So today I want to make a case, not for drinking more, but for understanding what we've lost and what wine, specifically wine, might help us find again. So let me start with the numbers, because the numbers are absolutely staggering. In 2023, the United States Surgeon General issued a formal advisory declaring loneliness and social isolation a public health epidemic. Not a trend, not a concern, an epidemic. The advisory found that roughly half of American adults reported experiencing measurable levels of loneliness, something that has grown much worse since the pandemic. The Surgeon General said that lacking social connection increases the risk of premature death at levels comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. 15 cigarettes a day. We ban cigarette ads, we put warning labels on packs, we spend billions on anti smoking campaigns. But loneliness, which carries the same mortality risk, we barely even talk about it. And it is hitting young people the hardest. The Surgeon General's advisory reported that people aged 15 to 24 now spend 70% less time in person with friends than the same age group did in 2003. 70%. That's nearly 1,000 fewer hours per year of face to face time. The share of high school seniors who gathered with friends almost every day dropped from 44% in 2010 to 32% just a few years later. Nearly 60% of Gen Z reports feeling lonely on a regular basis. So, researchers are calling this the friendship recession. The average American now claims to have two close friends, compared to five just a few decades ago. The percentage of adults who say they have no close friends at all, it's quadrupled since 1990. And the health consequences are real. Loneliness carries a 29% increased risk of heart disease, a 32% increased risk of stroke, and a 50% increased risk of developing dementia for older adults. Among young people, it's linked to depression, anxiety, and here's the bitter irony, to substance misuse. The very isolation we're trying to prevent is driving behaviors we're worried about. So that's where we are. We have a generation that is lonelier than any generation on record, spending less time together in person than any generation on record, and suffering the mental and physical health consequences. That's the backdrop for everything I'm about to say. Let's start with what we got wrong about alcohol. So, we have a loneliness crisis. And at the exact same time, we've been running a cultural campaign to convince young people that substance that the humans have used for thousands of years to bring people together is something they should avoid. Now, let me be clear about something before I go any further, because I know where this is heading and I know what some of you are thinking about. Alcoholism is real. Addiction is real. There are people listening to this for whom alcohol has been devastating. I'm not dismissing that. In fact, I'm not minimizing it, and I have enormous respect for anybody who's wrestled with the addiction and chosen sobriety. This has happened to me. This has happened to my family. This is difficult for those people. This is important. It is horrible, horrible for the people who suffer. And I'm not talking about the alcoholics. I'm talking about the wives and the husbands and the children and the families and the brothers and the sisters and friends and coworkers and customers and clients that are affected by the results of this disease. But we have done ourselves a disservice by reducing alcohol to its worst outcomes and ignoring its oldest function. And I think the data bears that out. Let's talk about the cultural pendulum. Only 54% of American adults now say they drink alcohol. That is the lowest number we've ever tracked, and Gallup has been doing this for almost 100 years. The steepest decline, young people. So Gen Z is drinking roughly 20% less than the previous generations at the same age. Why? Well, there's a few reasons. So Gen Z is one of the first generations raised entirely under the 21 drinking age. They're more health conscious. The messaging that they've received has been consistent and aggressive. Alcohol is bad for you, period. There's no safe amount. That's the line they've internalized. For those of my age bracket, we did the same thing with marijuana. We declared it a gateway drug to crack cocaine, heroin addiction, and death. We also had First Lady Nancy Reagan encouraging us to just say no. We watched an ad with our Saturday morning cartoons of an egg frying, warning us that this was our brain on drugs. So, this part of the phenomenon is nothing new. But there's another reason why I think it's underappreciated. Gen Z came of age during COVID. And during COVID, they didn't experience the social element of drinking. They didn't sneak a beer at night with their high school buddies at a party. They didn't share a bottle of wine at a college dinner. What they saw was their parents drinking at home, alone, and by the way, often too much as a coping mechanism, as something to do when they were bored. Their introduction to alcohol was not connection, it was isolation and excess. And there's no wonder that they want to have nothing to do with it. And there's the camera. Every moment is now potentially recorded. Every loss of control is a potential social media disaster. A Northeastern University historian put it perfectly. If you lose control, it's going to be filmed and it's going up online. The desire for control over how you're perceived, how you're represented is enormous for this generation. And alcohol, by definition, loosens control. We've been here before. Now, before we get too righteous about alcohol being the villain, let's step back and recognize a pattern that should make us just a little bit more humble. We have always had a drug du jour, and we have almost always gotten that story wrong. So, cocaine, health tonic, was literally in Coca-Cola. Sigmund Freud championed it. Doctors prescribed it for everything from toothaches to depression. It was the pick-me-up of its era, until, of course, it wasn't. Well, right now, psychedelics are having their moment. Psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine, substances that were demonized for decades, that would land you in prison, are now being studied at Johns Hopkins and legalized for therapeutic use. The science changed, and the story changed. Cannabis went from reefer madness to wellness product in one generation. 40 years ago, it would destroy your life, unless you were Cheech or Chong. Now, on every single corner in many, many places, there's a dispensary, and it's marketed as self-care. The substance didn't change, the narrative did. And look at what we've done with food, the thing we put in our bodies more than anything else. In 1992, the United States government built a food pyramid and told 300 million Americans to eat 6 to 11 servings of bread and pasta a day and minimize fat. And now many nutritionists say that pyramid should be inverted, that those carbohydrates were driving the obesity epidemic the whole time. We went to war against fat, realized sugar was the enemy, we fought corn syrup, embraced natural sugars, then we decided all sugars were the problem. We swung from mass-produced to organic, from calorie counting to keto to intermittent fasting. Eggs were bad for you. Then they were good. Then they were bad again. Then they were good again. Butter was poison for 30 years. Now it's back. Coffee would kill you. Then it was a superfood. All I know is I need a cup or two every morning, or I have some horrible headache and some constipation. Every decade, the science of the day tells us something new and contradicts what came before. The point is not that science is wrong. The point is that we have a cultural habit of seizing on incomplete evidence, turning it into an absolute moral position, and then swinging to the opposite extreme when the evidence shifts. And that's exactly what's happening with alcohol right now. Wine's own history proves the point. Wine was a health drink for most of human history, for thousands of years. Wine existed because water would kill you. Mixing wine with water was a public health measure. The Romans spread viticulture across Europe, not just for pleasure, but for survival. Wine kept people alive. And then we made it sacred. Wine isn't just in our culture, it's in our religions. The blood of Christ in the Eucharist, the Kiddush cup on Shabbat, monks in Burgundy and Champagne who preserved winemaking through the Dark Ages because they believed it was holy work. For centuries, we didn't just tolerate wine, we considered it a gift from God. And then came the French paradox in the 1990s. Suddenly, the whole country was told that red wine might be the reason that French people ate butter and cheese and foie gras and still had lower rates of heart disease. Wine sales surged. A health claim drove consumption. And now, the pendulum has swung again. Today, the messaging is the opposite. There is no amount of alcohol that's safe. The same substance that was sacred, it was medicinal, and then heart healthy, is now just pure risk. Maybe the truth, as it always is, lives somewhere in the middle. And maybe we should be humble enough to consider what we're losing alongside with what we're trying to prevent. Let's talk about what alcohol actually does. Here's what the research consistently shows, and this part matters. Alcohol is an inherently social substance. It's predominantly consumed in social settings. It produces more pleasurable effects in the presence of others, and people report more euphoria, more enjoyment, more connection when drinking with other people versus drinking alone. It lowers social anxiety. It facilitates conversation. It makes it easier to approach a stranger, to open up to a friend, to stay at the table just a little longer. And this is not a bug. This is the feature. This is what alcohol has done for human beings for thousands of years, and it is quite literally a social lubricant. And I don't use that phrase casually. It greases the gears of human connection in a way that few other things do. And wine is especially social. Think about the rituals: the opening the bottle, the pouring someone else before yourself, the swirling, the smelling, the tasting, and then the turning to the people next to you and saying, "What do you think?" You don't do wine tasting alone. You don't pop a bottle of champagne by yourself. Wine's entire culture, its entire architecture is organized around the shared experience, around the table. So, when we tell a generation of young people just stop drinking, we're not just telling them to avoid a substance. We're removing one of the oldest and most effective mechanisms human beings have ever developed for sitting down together and connecting. And we're doing it in the exact moment that they need the mechanism more than ever. Let's talk about cannabis. Here's where it gets really, really interesting. And maybe this part is going to be a little bit uncomfortable. While we've been telling young people not to drink, we've simultaneously told them that cannabis is basically fine. Nearly half of US states have legalized recreational marijuana. Almost 80% of Americans now live in a county with at least one dispensary. Cannabis has been marketed to young consumers in drinks, in gummies, in vapes, with cheerful branding and wellness messaging. The cultural permission structure around cannabis is enormous. And I am not here to say it's wrong. I am not anti cannabis at all. What I want to do is look at what happens when you swap one for the other, when a generation trades the wine bar for the edible on the sofa, and ask an honest question about what that trade costs. The research on this is striking. National surveys of high school seniors found that more than half of marijuana users reported using it alone, compared to only a third of alcohol users. Qualitative research shows that young adults consistently associate alcohol with larger social settings, with parties and dinners and bars, while marijuana is associated with smaller or solitary settings. Cannabis trends toward the couch. Alcohol trends toward the table, and sometimes even the dance floor. And that solitary use pattern is not neutral. Studies consistently show that people who use cannabis alone are more likely to use it to cope with negative emotions like depression and stress and anxiety. They report more symptoms of dependence. They use on more days per month. The social context of how you use a substance matters enormously, and cannabis is increasingly being consumed without any social context at all. A 2021 study from the University of Washington found something that struck me when I read it. So the researchers looked at a group of young adults, and they found a clear dose response relationship. The more frequently someone used marijuana, the lonelier they reported feeling, and the less they reported flourishing across important aspects of their life. So happiness, relationships, purpose, health. Daily users showed the greatest difference from non-users. And here's the kicker. There was no statistically significant association between the frequency of alcohol use and any of the outcomes. Not loneliness, not flourishing, nothing. The researchers noted that frequent alcohol use may actually be more socially normative among young adults. It may reflect social engagement rather than withdrawal. Now, I'm going to say the quiet part out loud because I know some of you are bristling. And I am not saying that alcohol is good and cannabis is bad. That's not what this is. What I'm saying is that we might have swapped a substance that brings people to the table for one that keeps people on their couch. We traded a social ritual for a solitary one. And at the same time that loneliness is killing people at the rate of 15 cigarettes a day, that trade has consequences that we need to talk about honestly, not as a moral judgment, just as a sociological observation. The data supports us. Let's talk about wine as kind of infrastructure. So, if the crisis is loneliness, and if shared drinking has always been one of humanity's most powerful social technologies, then what does the wine industry do with that? Do we just market harder, slap some Gen Z branding on a label, and hope for the best? No. I really think that we have to rethink what we're actually offering. And I think the answer has a lot less to do with wine than you might expect. Third places. Sociologists have this concept they call the third places. So it's not your home, it's not your work, it's the other places where community happens. So for previous generations, these were classically churches and bowling leagues and Rotary clubs and barbershops, the neighborhood bar. They were the places where you showed up regularly and ran into the same people. And over time, you built the kind of casual, reliable social bonds that form the foundation of a connected life. Most of these places have declined. So church attendance is down, civic organizations are completely hollowed out. Neighborhood bars have been replaced. There are now craft cocktail lounges with a reservation system. The casual, low barrier gathering spaces where connection used to happen organically are disappearing. But wine bars, tasting rooms, winery visits, community wine events, these can serve that function. And by the way, some of them already do. I interviewed JC Restrepo for this podcast in the last couple of weeks, and he and his wife, Joanna, own Happy Wine Calle Ocho in Little Havana, Miami. The New York Times named this one of the top 25 restaurants in Miami. And you know how they got there? They didn't have a marketing budget. They didn't have a PR firm. They didn't have an Instagram strategy. They built a space with live music every night, graffiti on the walls from happy customers, and a cheap corkage fee that basically says, bring a bottle or buy one, sit down, and enjoy being here. There's abuelitas from Flagami, and they sit next to the business lunchers from Coral Gables. And it's a place where I met the local community police officer who tells me she stops by two places every day, the Senior Center and Happy Wine, just to have connection to the community. There's dancing, there's noise, there's life. The New York Times wrote that JC is serious about wine, but not how to enjoy it. And that line is everything. Because what JC and Joanna built isn't really a wine bar, it's a third place. It is the space where wine gives people permission to be together, and the rest just takes care of itself. That's what wine can be. The wine is not actually the point. The togetherness is the point. The wine is the vehicle. Let's talk about wine's built-in social architecture. Wine has something that cannabis and honestly, even beer and spirits don't have in the same way. Wine has rituals that are built around other people. So, first of all, you share a bottle. It's the fundamental unit of wine. It's not a single serving, but a vessel designed for multiple people. Opening a bottle is an act of generosity. You pour for someone else before yourself. You clink glasses. You make eye contact. You say the magic word, cheers, salud, santé. These aren't just traditions, they're like the original social cheat codes. They're mechanisms for creating connections that have been refined over centuries. Pairing wine with food means making a meal together, or at least sitting down to one. A wine tasting means conversation. What do you get on the nose? Is a question that invites kind of a genuine exchange. Wine dinners, harvest visits, tasting groups. These are all social structures that predate the loneliness crisis by centuries and could help address it if we lean into them instead of apologizing for them. The lost art of the long story. There's something else that happens at the table, and we're losing it. And it's kind of scary. It's storytelling, it's about how we communicate now. So, short form video has completely reshaped how we share experiences. Everything's a snippet or a clip, and maybe you're even watching this as a short. There are 15-second punchlines. Comedy used to be a long setup and a payoff. You just think about the great stand up specials, the way a comedian would build a story over 10 minutes and kind of bring the room around along for that ride. And now it's just a TikTok. Before that, it was a Vine, it was 6 seconds. You get the laugh and you move on. And look, some of that content is brilliant, and I'm not dismissing it, but something has been lost in the compression. Because the deep human bonding experience has always been long form. It's always been sitting with somebody. It's always been hearing their story, their real story. The one that takes a little while to tell, the one that meanders and doubles back, builds to something meaningful. It's telling your own story and watching someone actually listen, not glancing at their phone and not waiting for their turn to talk, listening. That kind of conversation, unhurried, winding, intimate, is where real connection happens. It's how friendships deepen. It's how trust is built. It's how we learn that other people have lived lives as complex and messy and beautiful as our own. And that kind of conversation is disappearing, mostly because it requires time. And time is the one thing that our culture has decided is too expensive to spend on each other. But here's what wine gives you. As long as there's still something in the bottle, you have permission to sit there. So the bottle is like a timer for connection. It's just sand falling through the hourglass, and it's saying, hey, we're not done yet. There's still a pour left. Stay. And that slight loosening that comes with a glass or two, that's not just social lubrication. It makes you a better storyteller and a better listener. It softens that self consciousness that makes people edit themselves. It creates the conditions for the kind of honest, unhurried exchange that used to be the backbone of social life. You know, when I think about like the great dinner parties I've been to, the ones that I remember, the ones that ended up mattering, it was never about the food. I mean, I've had some good food. It was never about the wine itself, as memorable as the bottle might be. It was always that story after the second glass. It was the moment that somebody opened up about something real. It was the laughter that came from the shared experiences that took 5 minutes to set up properly. You just don't get that in a 15-second clip. You don't get that alone on your couch. You can only get that at a table with time, with people, with something in the glass that gives everybody to stay a little bit longer. I want to talk about wine as a practice of presence. There's something else that wine does, and we just absolutely do not talk about it enough. So far, we've talked about wine connecting people to each other, but wine also connects you to yourself. And maybe even more importantly, it disconnects you from the thing that's making all of this worse, the dopamine trap. So, we are living in an era of sensory overload and sensory numbness all at the same time. So think about that. Our phones are delivering us a constant stream of dopamine hits, notifications and scrolling and autoplay and algorithmic feeds designed by very smart people to keep us looking at that screen. And the result is that our brains have been trained to skim everything and experience nothing deeply. We don't listen to full albums anymore. What's the last time that you sat down, put on a record, or even slipped on Spotify and just listened? We don't sit with a meal. We eat while scrolling. We have music on, but we're not hearing it. It's just background noise, background life. Our senses have been dulled by devices that were designed to hijack our attention, and the cost is that we lost touch with textures, experiences, the things that make us feel actually alive. You know, I think about how we used to spend more time feeling things, like listening to music and really listening and smelling food as it cooked, noticing the quality of light in a room. These sensory experiences used to be the fabric of daily life, and now they're just buried under a pile of notifications. Let's talk about wine as mindfulness. Think about what happens when you actually taste wine, not drink it, taste it. You look at the color. You really look at it. Is it ruby or is that garnet? Is it pale gold or is it like a deeper amber? You swirl the glass, you watch the legs form on the side, you bring it to your nose, and this is where something really remarkable happens. You try to identify what you are smelling. Is that cherry? Is that earth? Is that something floral? And you're searching. You're paying attention. You're present in a way that almost nothing else in your daily life demands. Then you taste it and you pay attention to what's happening on your palate. The front of your tongue, the sides, the back, the texture. Is it silky or grippy? How does it finish? Does it change? What happens 30 seconds after you swallow? That whole sequence, the see, the swirl, the sip, it's really just a mindfulness practice, whether anybody calls it that or not. Your phone's forgotten, the scroll stops, you're here in the moment with this glass. It's almost like yoga. Yoga asks you to connect your breath to your body. Wine asks you to connect your experience to your senses. And both are practices that slow you down and anchor you in the present. Both require attention and both reward you for showing up fully. The difference is wine does it around a table with other people. It's contemplative and it's social all at the same time. And how many things in modern life can even say that? Sensory memory, what the wine world gets wrong. This thing drives me crazy about how the wine world talks about this. And I say this as someone who went through his W set, who loves the technical side of wine, who respects the craft of tasting. But I think we have made a big mistake here. When we teach people to taste wine, we are handing them a vocabulary list: cassis, leather, tobacco, whetstone, mushroom. And we basically tell them, identify these flavors, and then you're doing it right. So we take tasting and we make it into a math formula. We find the correct answer. We name the compound. We match the descriptor to the textbook. And listen, I understand for wine professionals, it's really important. It gives us kind of a standardized language to help share objective information. But that's not what smells and tastes actually are. Smells and tastes are experiential. They're portals. They connect to moments in time. You know what I mean, right? So you catch a scent and suddenly you're somewhere else. That's my grandmother's kitchen on a Sunday when we'd arrive and she'd been cooking all morning. That's the flowers at my friend's wedding. Do you remember they had gardenias everywhere? That's the campfire from that trip we took, the one where it rained and we almost didn't go. That's the leather in my father's briefcase upstairs in his attic study back on Lattimore Road. That's the smell of cut grass on the first warm day of spring. These are not tasting notes. These are memories. And when you're sitting at a table with someone and you swirl a glass and you say to them, this reminds me of, that's not wine education. That's human connection through shared sensory experience. That's someone who's opening a door to a moment in their life and they're inviting you in. So music does this too. A song comes on and you're back in high school. You're back in that car. You're back at that concert. Taste and smell work the same way. Actually, they work even more powerfully because smell is the sense that is most directly connected to memory in the brain. And wine is one of the most aromatically complex things that humans consume. A single glass can trigger a cascade of associations that are deeply, irreducibly personal. So, what do we do with this extraordinary gift? We reduce it to a standardized list of approved descriptors. We make people that aren't wine professionals feel like they're failing if they can't identify cassis. We turn a profoundly personal experience into a test. And I think that is one of the main reasons why people find wine intimidating. Not because the terminology is hard, by the way, it is, but because we frame tasting as something you get right or wrong, whether it's actually something you feel. The right answer to what do you taste is never cassis. The right answer is whatever memory that glass unlocks for you. And when you share that memory with the person sitting across from you, something really magical happens. Now you're not talking about wine anymore. You're talking about your life, and they're talking about theirs. So let's talk about recalibrating the senses. And once you start paying attention to wine this way, it's not a test, but it's a practice of noticing. Something really interesting happens. You start paying attention to everything else. So the food tastes different because you're actually tasting it. The bread at dinner has complexity you never even noticed. The herbs in your garden smell just a little more vivid. Music hits differently when you're sitting still with a glass instead of half listening while you doom scroll. Wine doesn't just train your palate, it trains your capacity for attention, it recalibrates your whole sensory world. It's a gateway back to noticing the details of being alive as a human. And that matters because I think what we've lost is not just connection to each other, but connection to the sensory details that make life rich. The smell of bread baking, the feel of a linen tablecloth, the sound of a cork being pulled, the way a great glass of wine evolves from the first sip to the last, changing and revealing itself as it opens up in the glass. These are the textures of a complete life, the small, physical, present tense experiences that no algorithm could replicate and no screen can deliver. And wine, more than anything else I know, teaches you to notice it again. It's not just a drink, it's a practice of being alive. So, what do we do with this? Where does all this leave us? So, what I'll tell you is what it means to me for what I'm building and what I think it means for the industry. I call this the preface paradox. So, I'm opening a wine bar called Preface in Delray Beach, Florida. And here's the thing my plan relies heavily on technology. We're building these tech tools to connect young people, to lower the intimidation barrier, to meet that generation where they are. And I do deeply believe in that. But sitting here, working through everything I just said to you, I'm realizing something. The most important thing that Preface can do is not to connect young people to wine through technology. It's to use technology as the bridge that gets them in the door and then encourages them to reconnect with themselves, with each other, with the experience of being present in a room with other human beings. The tech gets them there. The wine gives them a reason to stay. And what happens at that table? The conversation, the presence, the shared experience of paying attention to what's in that glass. That's the thing that actually matters. That's the thing that no technology can replicate. We have a resurgence with wine that tracks a societal need for connection. The hunger is there. People are craving it. But we have to frame what we're offering correctly. It's not a beverage. It's an experience of presence and togetherness in a world that is starving for both. So, to everybody in wine, talking to the producers and the retailers, the sommeliers, the wine bar owners, the content creators, I want to challenge you with this. Stop selling wine. Start selling what wine does. Connection with others, connection with yourself, disconnection from the dopamine cycle, presence. Every wine brand in America is marketing flavor profiles and especially ratings on an artificial 90-point scale where apparently no one scores less than 90. Almost nobody is marketing the fact that wine is one of the last activities in modern life that asks you to slow down, to pay attention, be in a room with other people. That's the pitch. That's the real pitch. and reframe that health conversation. I know we've been on the defense on this for years, and I know that the messaging has been brutal. But the Surgeon General said loneliness is as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. If wine brings people to the table, if it creates the social connection that the Surgeon General desperately says that we need, then that's a health outcome too. We can make that case honestly, we can make it responsibly, we can make it compassionately, and we don't need to be defensive about it. We can be constructive. Invest in spaces, invest in the tasting rooms and the wine bars and the community events. These are not revenue channels. They are social infrastructure. They are third places. They are the physical antidote to a world that keeps everybody isolated behind a screen and treat them that way. For you and to everyone listening, whether you're in the industry or just somebody who enjoys a glass of wine, here's what I'd ask. Open a bottle tonight. Don't drink it alone. Call a friend. Invite the neighbor over. Sit at a table and leave your phone in the other room. And if you're in this business, ask yourself an honest question. Does what I do create connection, or am I just trying to create transactions? And if you know somebody in their 20s who thinks wine isn't for them, it's not about the wine. It was never about the wine. It's about giving them a seat at the table and a reason to be present. The Surgeon General didn't tell us to drink more. I'm not telling you to drink more. What I'm telling you is loneliness is killing people. That connection saves them. That for thousands of years, wine has been one of the most powerful excuses human beings have ever invented to sit down together. But it's more than that. Wine should help you to be present, to slow down, to pay attention, to taste and smell and feel the world around you. In a culture that is drowning in dopamine and starving for real experience, that's not a luxury, that's a lifeline. So stop apologizing for it. Open a bottle, call a friend, sit at the table, and pay attention to what's in the glass, because that might just remind you to pay attention to everything else.